Hello and welcome to the Kim Iverson Show. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. So, there's a new virus spreading in China, causing some alarm and even some panic. This time, it affects kids. That's the one demographic that they couldn't get us on last time, right? People they found out maybe didn't quite care so much about the old people as much. So they're thinking maybe this time, if it goes after the kids, everybody will lock down. Let's just hope. Let's hope, knock on wood, that that's not what's going to happen. Well, here's the article that recently came out in DW. A sharp rise in respiratory illnesses, particularly among children, has sparked fears of a new virus emerging from China. As cold and flu season begins, Chinese authorities insist no new pathogens have been detected. They say, "Don't worry, no new pathogen." So the article goes on to say, China on Sunday. So this was written just 2 days ago. China on Sunday told local authorities to increase the number of medical clinics that can handle a surge in respiratory illnesses in the country. The call comes after China's National Health Commission 2 weeks ago reported a large increase in pneumonia cases, mostly in children. The report triggered memories of the COVID-19 pandemic, with social media users fearing a new virus coming from China or a new COVID. Yes, we're worried about this because it's deja vu 4 years later, right in time for an election season, almost exactly to the day. It's 4 years to the day nearly when the last China virus came around and ended up causing us, wreaked havoc on all of our lives. It says last week, the public disease surveillance system, ProMed, reported that some Chinese hospitals were overwhelmed with sick children. Do these words ring a bell? Overwhelmed with sick children. This outbreak was said to be mainly in the capital, Beijing, but also in the northeastern Liaoning province and other areas in China. So what did Chinese health officials advise? Quote, efforts should be made to increase the number of relevant clinics and treatment areas, appropriately extend service hours, and strengthen guarantees of drug supplies, National Health Commission spokesperson Mi Feng told a news conference on Sunday. Mi said the sharp rise in acute respiratory illnesses was linked to the simultaneous circulation of several kinds of pathogens, most prominently influenza. Symptoms, so this would be a flu, another flu, although they're saying they haven't identified this. Symptoms include, or they haven't diagnosed it. They're saying these are cases of pneumonia that they haven't diagnosed, so they don't really know. Symptoms include fever, lung inflammation without a cough, and pulmonary nodules, lumps on the lungs that are usually the result of a past infection. No deaths have been reported. China is facing its first full winter since it eased its strict zero COVID policy that forced lockdowns and quarantines to quell the spread of the virus. Several experts have pointed, now this is interesting, several experts have pointed to winter's arrival and the end of COVID restrictions and a lack of prior immunity in children as likely being behind the surging infections. So because China locked up their kids and the kids weren't able to go out there and actually catch diseases like kids do, they have a lack of immunity to disease. And now that suddenly the economy's opened up and China's no longer doing their zero COVID insanity, the kids are out and the kids are catching illnesses. So that's what happens when you destroy an immune system, right? When you harm an immune system. This is another one of those unintended consequences of the lockdowns. And we're seeing so many more of them as time has gone on, time after time after time. We keep seeing more and more of these unintended consequences. They said, no, this was for everybody's good. Lockdown, lockdown. And many of us said, oh, this is going to end up in a disaster. This is a disaster. And there's going to be more disasters we can't even fathom at this point. Some ramifications from these lockdowns we can't even dream of at this moment. We just know the ones we know. But what about all the ones we don't know? Well, this is one that we kind of knew, actually, that if people aren't around each other and they're not circulating around their little germs, that they're going to have a weakened immune system and they're going to be more susceptible to stuff. So it goes on to say China's cabinet, the state council, warned on Friday of the risk of a rebound in COVID infections alongside influenza and mycoplasma pneumonia infection, a common bacterial infection that typically affects young people, which has circulated since May. All localities should strengthen information reporting on infectious diseases to ensure information is reported in a timely and accurate manner, the state council said in a statement. Earlier this week, now this is also interesting, earlier this week, the WHO called on China to provide more information about the surge in cases By Friday, the Geneva-based health body said no new or unusual pathogens had been found in the recent illnesses in China. So the WHO is saying, this is, again, deja vu, 4 years later, almost to the day, because they said that last time. Last time they said, no, there's no new or unusual pathogen circulating around China. And then there was a lot of accusations that the WHO was actually covering up for China and that they were working in cahoots. And there was some evidence of that. Because if you remember when the journalist was trying to question the WHO about Taiwan, and the minute they said Taiwan, it was like a pariah had entered the room, and suddenly the WHO head shut down all questioning and ended the conversation immediately with that person who was talking about Taiwan. So they're very in bed with China in a lot of ways, and perhaps helped cover up the last COVID. So I want to read this other article to you. This is from Zero Hedge. WHO recommends masks, social distancing in China amid mystery pneumonia outbreak. There's nothing to see here, says the WHO. There's no new pathogen, no big deal. But start social distancing and wear your masks. So the World Health Organization is recommending that people in China wear masks, socially distance, and stay home if they're unwell, as cases of an undiagnosed pneumonia has been detected in hospitals in Beijing and Liaoning. Okay, so this new virus could end up, maybe it won't be something where they feel like they have to lock us down for, but just right there, masks, and stay home and socially distance. So we're going to be living like this for the rest of our lives we might get sick, everybody, in the winter, because, in the winter we get sick. That's what happens. And they're going to say no holidays for you. No family get-togethers. Keep them small. None of those big family gatherings. Goes on to say the WHO, which of course helped China cover up during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, says no unusual or novel pathogens have been detected. Both China and the WHO have faced questions about the transparency of reporting on the earliest COVID-19 cases that emerged in the central city of Wuhan in late 2019. At this stage, there's nothing to suggest that it may be a new variant of COVID, said Bruce Thompson, head of the Melbourne School of Health Sciences at the University of Melbourne, discussing the preliminary data. So at this stage, there is nothing to suggest that it may be a new variant of COVID. So that would actually be a relief if it were just another variant of COVID, because we're all pretty used to it at this point, right? We've gone through how many different variations of COVID. At this point, most everybody's had COVID, whether you were vaccinated or not, or triple vaxxed or quadruple vaxxed, or, COVID, the vaccines did not stop the spread of COVID. People got COVID. And so people are less afraid of it because people have had it, they got through it, and they're no longer afraid of that unknown. So it'd almost be better if this were just a new strain of COVID. Most of us would just go, okay, yeah, right, I've had COVID a couple times, got over it. The last time it was really mild, okay. I'm building up my immune system. But when they say, oh, this is not COVID, and this is something else, and it's affecting kids, and they're overwhelming hospitals, this is what is going to cause that concern and panic. And I think a lot of people will not be panicked. I think the people who weren't panicked around COVID won't be panicked regarding this, but maybe because this time they're saying, but it's the children. It's the children. Before you could say, well, but the older people it was affecting, they were like on average 85 years old. I mean, we're talking about people who are already in nursing homes. They were already in hospice care. A lot of the people who died in the early bouts of COVID-19, but the kids, when it's the kids, that's a whole different story. They have their whole lives ahead of them. And so there's reason to fear because, of course, if you cut off the life of a child, you're cutting off 70, 80, 90 years of life. It's not somebody who's in hospice in a nursing home. So this is scarier when they say kids. I still think that most people are not going to be freaked out by this, but I think the people who are still freaked out by COVID, and there are many, they're certainly going to be freaked out by this. And unfortunately, many of them are in control. They're in charge. They run the government. And they run our local municipalities, and they want us to mask, and they want us to socially distance, and they want to do lockdowns and closures and say businesses have to do takeout, and you could only do drive-by pickups. You can't go in and mingle. And we're going to see perhaps more rounds of this, especially those of us who unfortunately live in areas who are controlled by people who want that endless masking, have not come to terms with their failures when it came to managing the pandemic, and may be apt to do it again, so that this time they could hopefully be right and say, ha, I told you so. I'm vindicated. Meanwhile, the rest of us suffer, and most of us have been vindicated. Most of us that were calling out all of this from the beginning have been vindicated. But here we are again, rigmarole once again, 4 years later, almost to the day. It was what, I think it was first detected. December is when it first came public. Right after Thanksgiving, it became, or was it even around Thanksgiving? I'm trying to remember the exact day of when there's this virus in China and circulating around. People are passing out and dry, and oh no. And then suddenly by March, April here in the United States, we were in full blown lockdown. So let's hope that doesn't happen in the next 4, 5, 6 months, just in time for election season. But I wouldn't be surprised if that is what happens. Are you tired of being targeted with phishing emails, fed up with spam cluttering your inbox, concerned about companies like Google or the government spying on your private conversations? Then it is time to switch to StartMail. StartMail is a secure alternative to Gmail that lets you send emails like they're in a sealed envelope, making sure your communication stays private and secure. Services like Google collect your data and they use it for targeting ads. StartMail is a strictly ad-free service that does not collect or share any data with third parties for advertisement or tracking. Your StartMail account comes with all the features you need, including unlimited disposable email addresses to protect your inbox from phishing scams and hacking attempts. And switching to StartMail is super easy. So if you're worried about your old emails stored on Gmail or Outlook or Yahoo, well, they've got you covered because they have a hassle-free migration tool that lets you move your emails and contacts with just a few clicks. No technical knowledge required. So over the past decade, StartMail has become a trusted name in email privacy, and they have a great deal still going on, actually, for Black Friday, Cyber Monday. I love it when these things extend. So they are offering 50% off annual subscriptions plus an additional 3 months free. All you have to do is go to startmail.com/Iverson to sign up now. That is StartMail with a T, startmail.com/Iverson. And the offer ends November 30th. So what is that? That's in like 2 days. So don't wait. Go get your StartMail and start sending secure emails. Well, what's happening in Ireland? The riots, the anti-immigration sentiments, the new hate speech censorship attempts. And, are the Irish now just a bunch of far-right bigots? Or is there something else, perhaps legitimate, about their grievances? Let's first do a quick recap of the recent events, which have been dubbed the most violent in modern Dublin history, which have now led to dystopian censorship attempts. Last week, outside of a primary school, a man in his 50s stabbed 3 young kids and their adult care assistant who was trying to shield them. One 5-year-old little girl was seriously injured, as well as the adult care assistant. The other 2 kids were thankfully spared serious injuries. And the man was then disarmed by 3 men who jumped to the rescue. Then people came around to kick the bastard, and a couple of women then intervened by forming a human circle around him to ensure that the attacker was arrested alive. So then word got out via messaging services like Telegram, WhatsApp, and Signal that the attacker was an illegal immigrant. And word also spread that the kids had been killed. And because word also spread that the attacker was Arab, word then spread that it was a terror attack. So people then encouraged crowds to go protest to make their feelings known. And they used the hashtag Ireland is full. Now, riots then broke out. And the Irish did not hold back. A lot of stuff went up in flames, including a bus with the word out painted on it. There were a few hundred people involved in total. Some were holding Irish flags and signs reading Irish Lives Matter. Some shouted slogans like "Get them out." 34 arrests have been made. 3 cops suffered serious injuries. About a dozen shops and vehicles were destroyed. And now there are calls for social media censorship to stop the spread of misinformation. And there was misinformation, which there oftentimes is, not just from social media, but also from mainstream news and even government officials themselves. But let's go over some of the facts. So the kids did survive, though one is still hospitalized. The attacker is not an illegal immigrant, though he is an immigrant from Algeria. He'd been living in Ireland for 20 years with Irish citizenship for the past 10 of those years. And there's no evidence the attack was terrorism-based. In fact, the attacker is a homeless man, which likely means he has mental problems. So All of this new information did not placate, will all of this, I should say, will this information placate the rioters and those who share the anti-immigration sentiments? Probably not, because the reality for the working class in Ireland is beyond this one incident. They are angry over immigration. And let's watch this clip. This is Gary Knievy with the National Party of Ireland, which is considered a far-right nationalist party. But he's going to explain some of the grievances that some of the Irish are feeling. Watch this.
We're members of the National Party, and we're here in Ballinasloe, the largest and most important town in East Galway. We are coming to the end of another year, and the struggle intensifies to preserve the Irish nation and true Irish identity. The National Party, which represents thousands of patriotic Irish nationalists, resolutely oppose the relentless ongoing treachery of our contemptible, bought-off political establishment, as that body of traitors ramp up their campaign to make the Irish a minority in their own country in as short a period of time as possible. Their main weapon in the campaign to achieve that aim is by encouraging and promoting mass immigration. This means tens of thousands of foreigners entering this country year after year, uncontrolled, unvetted and unrestricted. It is a lethally dangerous, reckless and downright evil policy that has disastrous consequences for ordinary Irish people with regards to employment opportunities, housing, medical services and educational opportunities, as non-nationals are invariably given priority over Irish people in all these areas. Over the past 18 months or so, Ukrainians make up the majority of the deluge of foreigners who are swamping our small island home, the only real homeland that Irish people have or will ever have. No amount of trouble is too great for our government when it comes to sourcing accommodation for and looking after Ukrainians and other foreign nationals. The feelings and concerns and the wishes of local Irish communities are time and again ridden over roughshod by supposedly our government. Now there are plans for modular homes locally in Poolboy to accommodate a disproportionate number of Ukrainians, despite the fears and concerns of locals. It remains to be seen whether the government will take on board the concerns of locals or whether they will simply override their wishes. Going on previous form, the latter would seem to be the more likely.
Okay, so over the past decade, Ireland took on radical immigration policies that have rapidly changed the demographics, as you heard him talking about. And he's not pointing out Arabs. He's saying Ukrainians actually made up the vast majority of the immigrants, and that is true over the last year. The country has taken in about 1 million immigrants in the past 10 years. And in the last year, they took in way more Ukrainian immigrants per capita than really any other European nation. They took in far more than their fair share per capita, not in the sheer numbers basis. That was still Poland and Germany, but on a per capita basis. Philip Plinkington wrote this in Unheard. Before the riots, many outside of Ireland were unaware of just how radical the Republic's experiment with migration over the past decade has been. The numbers speak for themselves. A full 2.8% of the population is made up of people who have moved to Ireland only in the last year. That is a lot in 1 year. This means that if you walk down the average Irish street, 1 in 35 people will be newcomers to the country who just showed up this year. Okay. While Ireland has been accepting large numbers of migrants for a long time, this was turbocharged by the war in Ukraine. Ireland, whose political and media classes have become notably outward-looking over the past decade, wanted to prove its liberal values and committed to hosting huge numbers of Ukrainian refugees. On a per capita basis, Ireland accepted 6 times more refugees than Britain, and made almost no plans for how to accommodate them. The latest numbers show that Ireland's foreign-born population is about 1 million people, about 900 to 1 million people. This means that 18 to 20% of the Irish population is foreign-born. That is a lot. Here in the United States, it's about 15%. In the UK, it's about 15%. In Ireland, for it to be 18 to 20%, that is a very high demographic shift that has happened to Ireland over the last 10 years. He shared this graph in a tweet, but this is where you could kind of see the numbers. The orange is the United Kingdom, how many refugees they've taken in, and the blue is how many Ireland took in. So you can see as a percentage of the total population. So this is on a per capita basis. You can see that Ireland took in far more Ukrainian refugees. When it came to just overall immigration, Ireland had a higher rate of immigration. That would be their government's policies. And their net migration in the blue is just higher than the UK in general. So so Ireland is facing an unprecedented amount of immigration. And this is not something that the people voted on. This is what the people of Ireland are upset about, is that as it is, the economy is, it depends on who you are when it comes to the economy. The economy on paper, you've got Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Janet Yellen saying the economy's great, the economy's great. And then you've got working class people here in this country who are saying, I'm living paycheck to paycheck. Inflation's killing me. I can't fill up my car with gas. I can't put the same food on the table that I used to be able to put on the table. And so the middle class is suffering while the elites, the liberal elites in the country, just say, what are you talking about? Everything's fine. And they try to gaslight us into thinking that everything's just fine. That is going on not just here in the United States. That's happening all around Europe. That's happening all around many parts of the world. This is actually happening where government officials are always going to try to sugarcoat things because they don't want to tell you. I mean, what are they going to say? They're going to say, yeah, you're right. It's really bad. It's really bad. And I'm in government. It's my fault. I'm in charge. Shoot. Let me change some things. They never say that. They never say that. They always say, oh, it's not that bad. Everything's great. Look at the numbers. We have a thriving economy. You have Joe Biden coming out there saying, I've made more jobs, after the opening of the economy. I made more jobs than any president since FDR. And it's like, okay, anybody can manipulate the numbers. Anyone can manipulate the statistics, but the people are feeling it at home with their paychecks, their kitchen tables. They're feeling it. They're feeling it on an individual and on a family basis. And these Irish people are feeling it. They're feeling the stress of a piss poor economy just coming out of a pandemic. And now they've taken in all of these immigrants, and they're upset that the people of Ireland are not getting the resources they need to live a better life, but that these immigrants that come in, these refugees, get a bunch of free stuff. And that's fine if your economy is doing well. I think in a booming economy, people are just fine with that. They look at it and they think, well, we need the people. We need the help. We got a booming economy. I need to hire people. I got plenty of jobs. I got plenty of money. Everything's great. But when the economy isn't so great, and when our Western elite powers continue to go around the world waging warfare or provoking warfare, and then those refugees come fleeing in to these European countries and into here in America, but mostly the brunt of it has been taken in by Europe. People are going to take to the streets and they're going to be lighting some stuff up. And that is exactly what they've been doing in Ireland. Here's commentator, this is Kevin Marr on GB News, talking about the immigration issues Ireland is dealing with. He also summarizes it pretty well, so watch this.
I mean, Ireland is a bit of a paradox. Economically, it's doing incredibly well. Its tax receipts are overflowing. Jeremy Hunt looks on enviously, I've no doubt. But there are a lot of problems with housing. There are a lot of problems with dilapidation in those traditional communities. As Dougie was mentioning a few minutes ago, that his government has presided over and done very little about. Now, the problem that's taken place really in Ireland in the last decade is that 1 million migrants there or thereabouts have come and settled in Ireland over the last decade. It's been a massive social change very, very quickly, and typically, like in Britain and like lots of other European countries, done without the consent, the electoral consent of the Irish people. And it's created a very big backlash. And quite rightly, as Dougie was pointing out, over the course of the last year or 18 months, there have been a lot of disturbances. There have been a lot of protests. There's been a lot of anger, and on this occasion, it's spilled over into the rioting that we've seen. Now, you have to say immediately that all those people on the streets attacking Irish police officers were not necessarily making a sophisticated political point when they broke into sports shops to nick expensive trainers. But there is an awful lot of frustration there because Ireland is changing very, very rapidly. 20% of its resident population is now foreign born. Now, that is higher than Britain at about 15%, and it is higher even than the United States of America, that great melting pot, at about 14%. The comparator really is Sweden, got exactly the same percentage of its population that's foreign born. And as we can see in Sweden, there are all kinds of social and problems emanating from the communities that have settled there. And Sweden, peaceful Sweden, now has the highest gun murder rate in the European Union.
So the anti-immigration sentiment has been increasing rapidly throughout Europe. We've seen this over the past several years, and we've seen this with the rise of certain leaders who are getting elected or who nearly get elected. In France, we saw the popularity of Marine Le Pen. She skyrocketed in popularity, and she ran on anti-immigration. She actually called for a moratorium on all immigration and wanted to repeal several immigration laws. We also have Italy's prime minister currently elected, Italy's prime minister, Giorgia Meloni. She ran her campaign on curbing immigration. When she got elected, people thought, oh, it's Italy's Marine Le Pen, and this time she won. And the Italians are dealing with a lot of immigration as well. The man who may become the next Dutch prime minister, it depends on if he can form a government. So they do run on a coalition government in the Netherlands, and Geert Wilders. This has been making big news lately. This guy's wild. Look at it. Almost looks like a character right out of a movie, kind of almost out of Hunger Games. He kind of reminds me but in his mind, it is the Hunger Games, I suppose. He ran heavily on a platform that was very anti-immigration, and not just anti-immigration. He doesn't hold back. I would say he doesn't hold, like, if you think Trump didn't hold back, Geert Wilders really doesn't hold back. He says a lot of very, very harsh, abrasive things, particularly about Muslims, about Islam. He's incredibly against the immigration of Muslims or anybody from a Muslim country in particular, unless they're Christian, I believe. Even then, he actually went on trial at one point about 2011. They actually put him on trial for hate speech. He was found not guilty, but they were using a lot of his rhetoric and saying, "Oh, you were saying these very vile and terrible things about Muslims." And he says if he does become the Dutch prime minister, that he will. He's very pro-Israel. That he will. He believes the Palestinians they belong in Jordan, that Jordan is the Palestinian state, and that he will be moving the embassy to Jerusalem. So he's a very, he's won the election. This was a major upset. He did not get the majority because the way these parliamentary systems work, he got about 22% of the vote, but that was enough to put him in power to be the majority. And if he can form a government, then he'll be the prime minister of the Netherlands. Germany was also heavily criticized for taking in 1 million Syrian refugees. They've since matched that number with 1 million Ukrainian refugees, so they're really bringing people in. Now, Germany has a population crisis, and this is kind of interesting because this is a legitimate concern from the elite powers that be. So one group of people say, why are they doing this? Why are they purposefully immigrating in all of these people, not just to Germany, not just to Ireland, all over Europe? Why are they mixing things up and bringing all these people in and allowing it? A lot of the arguments is because there's a real population crisis in Europe. People are not having enough kids to continue supporting the economy at the rate that the economy needs to be supported. That as people become more educated, as people, as countries become more sophisticated, they tend to have fewer children. And this has now put Europe at potentially in a crisis situation. China has a similar situation because they did a one-child policy, and that is coming back to bite them in the rear end because they got a population of older people who are aging, And they've got people who are my age who are only children, all of them in my generation, and and maybe the generation below are all single children. And so they're going to have a population crisis. So that is a legitimate concern. The question is, how do you deal with that? And do you deal with that by importing in or allowing this immigration in from these people that are really coming in under stressful and dire circumstances? So you don't get to select or really, you don't. The immigration process is different for refugees than it is for somebody that just wants to immigrate to America because they have some sort of or anywhere because they have some sort of skill set, or they have, they want to offer something, or they have family there already and they want to kind of immigrate to reunite. It's different in a refugee situation. Obviously, the Syrian refugee crisis, that is because of the Syrian civil war that was very much backed by the United States, very much was a part of that. There's been a major push in the West to oust Assad, and that has created a complete catastrophe. We've seen catastrophe from Libya. We've seen catastrophe from Iraq. So a lot of these countries, the immigrants are flooding into Europe. They're flooding into the United States. They're going, and it's because of war. Now you've got Ukraine. Well, NATO provoked Russia, and certainly it was Russia that invaded Ukraine. They didn't have to do that. It's on them, ultimately the final choice to pull the trigger, quite literally. But there was a definite provocation by NATO. Had NATO not provoked Russia, maybe there wouldn't be a war. Maybe there wouldn't be all of these millions, 8 million Ukrainian refugees that have been pretty much sprinkled all throughout Europe. So there's something there to consider, and it's a real problem that has to be balanced. You've got a population crisis that's legitimate, and you need to bring people in. But the question is, where do you bring them in from? Then you get into, does Germany, if they were to say, well, we only want white immigrants, that raises some eyebrows because Germany. So there's a lot, it's a very delicate situation and it's difficult. But one thing is for certain, and that is that the questions that these people are bringing forward, the grievances that these people who are taking to the streets are bringing forward are legitimate in that they themselves are not being cared for by their governments. They themselves are falling behind. They themselves are living paycheck to paycheck and are stressing and are not able to live the lives that they envisioned for themselves or even give the lives that they envisioned to their children. And instead, they're seeing the governments give and give and give to foreigners who are flooding into their country, competing for them for jobs, competing with them for housing, competing with them for resources. And it is causing riots. It is causing stress. And so countries, first of all, the European countries maybe ought to rethink their support of NATO warmongering adventures around, and particularly the Middle East and into Africa. This is causing major crises. So there maybe will be a shift, and we might see that sentiment shift. We are seeing some of that sentiment shift already in Europe, where many of them are starting to wonder, why are we always backing the United States and all of their different, their military adventurism around the globe? Why are we supporting this? Because it's only affecting us. We're the ones who have to absorb all of these immigrants, these refugees that are fleeing in from the Middle East and from Africa. Another question is, how long will the EU last? The EU has open borders. People are able to immigrate into Germany, all of those Syrian refugees and those Ukrainian refugees. But then once they establish that they have EU residency, they're able to move around the EU and live anywhere they want in the entire EU, including Ireland. They can go anywhere they want for the most part. There's some countries like the UK, which Brexited out, but we might see an increase in exits from the EU. So I do think we're going to see this. There is definitely a crisis that needs to be solved, a population crisis that needs to be solved. But on the other hand, with the economies the way they are, people just get left behind, and that is not going to work either. And you end up with very angry people. All right, imagine this. You slide into a pair of gravity defier shoes and suddenly you feel like you're walking on clouds. It is like your feet are getting a big comfy hug with every step. Well, let me tell you about the revolutionary comfort of gravity defier shoes. So whether you're a busy professional, an active mom or dad, or just someone who's on their feet constantly or constantly on the go, Gravity Defier has the perfect pair for you. Olive View UCLA Medical Center conducted a double-blind study proving that Gravity Defier shoes reduce 85% of knee pain using their patented shock absorption VeroShock technology. And for a limited time, our friends at Gravity Defier are offering an exclusive limit holiday season deal. Use code KIM30 for $30 off of orders of $100 or more at gdefy.com. That's gdefy.com. Just in time for the holidays. From work to workouts, date nights to weekends, Gravity Defier has a style for every occasion. And with this exclusive offer, there's no reason to settle for anything less than the absolute best for your feet. So head to gdefy.com, pick your style, and remember to use code KIM30 at checkout for $30 off of orders of $100 or more. And this offer does expire December 20th. So hurry and treat your feet to the comfort that they deserve. Have you ever heard of the curse of the 8th decade? Now, I hadn't heard about it until today when I randomly came across it, and it is fascinating and it's eerie. It's sort of a biblical curse that many in Israel are aware of. In fact, Prime Ministers Ehud Barak, Naftali Bennett, and Benjamin Netanyahu have all brought it up in various speeches. Now, the theory is that no kingdom of Israel can last beyond its 8th decade. The two previous kingdoms of Israel fell at around 80 years of existence, and now that Israel is in its 75th year, the curse would bring about the end of the nation within the next 5 years. Now, I want to read to you from this piece. This is written by Menachem Rahat for a Jerusalem-based organization called Mizrahi World Movement, which is a very religious Zionist movement, but he explains a bit of this curse of the 8th decade, which is so interesting. Now, of course, this is sort of mythical in a lot of ways. This is not prophecy so much. This is, it's kind of a mythical thing. So whether you believe this or not, it's still interesting. And we'll see what this means for the state of Israel and how this plays in. So the state of Israel, now in its 8th decade of life and about to celebrate its 75th birthday, is today closer than ever before the danger of fratricidal war, each man against his brother. This is the moment to learn from history before we destroy ourselves through the fire of hate. Now, this was written maybe a year ago it must have been. This is not recent. This is not a totally recent piece. So it says, we have much to learn from history. Twice before there existed here in the land of Israel sovereign Jewish kingdoms, and at the beginning of the collapse of both kingdoms began in the 8th decade of their existence. So the 8th decade would be when you're in your 70s. That's when you're in your 8th decade. So you would never see 80 is what this prophecy says, this prophecy or this curse. This curse is that the land of Israel cannot remain a Jewish nation. They just will never see their 80th birthday as a nation, as a Jewish nation. So both kingdoms existed for about 220 years, but the beginning of their end sprouted with incredible timing in the 8th decade of their sovereignty. It is the duty of Israelis here and now to ensure that the situation here does not become a rerun of a terrible movie we've seen twice before. So even though those nations existed for 220 years, they really ended or shifted, or things really, really changed, and they no longer were that sovereign nation they thought they were going to be once they hit about 80 years old. And here's Israel today at 75 years. And I think many of us are seeing the events that are happening now and thinking, yeah, there is a possibility that in this next 5 years, the entire ideology of what that land is supposed to be, especially to people like Netanyahu, might actually disappear when there's a two-state solution that could cause an end to the kingdom in the visionment that many in the kingdom have. And I'll explain that a little bit more. But he goes on and he talks about the first Jewish state. So he says the first Jewish state, founded by King David, accomplished phenomenal achievements and survived united for 80 years. In the 81st year, due to internal conflicts, the kingdom of the house of David disintegrated into the separate kingdoms of Yehuda and Yisrael, and so began its fall. So even though the nation remained intact, as a nation, it still in its 81st year saw a division, and that division ultimately led to the ultimate demise of the nation, which happened about 100 years or 150 years later. In the process, we lost millions of our brothers, the members of the 10 tribes, who, according to Rabbi Akiva, will not return in the future. So this is when the 10 tribes of Israel were lost, the kingdom disintegrated, and that happened in its 81st year of existence, or 80th year, 81st year. The second Jewish state was the Hasmonean kingdom during the Second Temple era. It existed for 77 years as a united and sovereign kingdom. In the 8th decade of its life, the kingdom was torn apart by infighting, which led the representatives of the two camps claiming the crown to approach Pompey in Syria, even one begging him to agree to make them vassals of Rome. And so the sovereign Hasmonean state became a degraded protectorate state of Rome, devoid of proud Jewish sovereignty. So at 77 years, that nation fell and became part of Rome, and that was the end of that. So there's this thinking that the same thing will happen the third time around. The establishment of the state of Israel 75 years ago is the third attempt to overcome the curse of the 8th decade, which defeated the two previous Jewish states. We're currently in the midst of our third opportunity, but it is uncertain whether we will survive it. Before our eyes, we are witnessing fratricidal hatred, and now it really doesn't matter who started it, because both sides bear equal responsibility for the terrible social chaos that is eating us apart. Just as Bourguiba predicted, all the warning signs of a national catastrophe are flashing red and don't under any circumstances count on the possibility of a fourth chance. Small comfort. Now, then he goes on and says, well, but we're not the only ones who've suffered this curse. There have been many other nations who have suffered this curse as well, and he's going to go through them. And I think this is like a telltale, if this is, if you believe in this, and which many of the Israeli politicians do. They talk about this in their speeches. As I mentioned, the prime ministers, they bring it up. Although some people say, well, they just bring it up because they're trying to scaremonger all of the Israeli people to not turn against the state, that we can't have any infighting. Don't turn against us. Don't question us, because if you do, you know what's going to happen. There's going to be the fall. We won't make it out of that 8th decade curse. So some of the politicians, they think, use it, as a way to keep people from questioning the establishment. But it is something that Israeli politicians talk quite a bit about. It is something that, like, these religious Zionists talk about. It's on the minds of many in Israel, and I just find it the most fascinating thing. I'd never heard about it before today. But here's what they say about other nations who've experienced the same curse. So he says, small comfort can be found in the fact that other nations have also experienced the curse of the 8th decade in a very painful way. The bloody American Civil War broke out 85 years after the adoption of the Constitution. Oh, what luck. It happened to them in the 9th decade, he says. Italy became fascist, and Germany became a Nazi terrorist state in the 8th decade after each nation's unification. The Third Republic of France, founded in 1871, surrendered to the Nazi boot in 1940 in its 8th decade, while the communist monster that was born in the October Revolution of 1917 began to disintegrate in the 1980s and was finally shattered into pieces 74 years after its founding in 1991. So that's interesting. It's not just these ancient kingdoms of Israel that suffer this 80-year fate, but it's these other nations as well, that something happens at 80 years that causes change, radical change, even demise. And he goes on to address this. He says, what is the spell that brings crisis and breaks up kingdoms in a nation's 8th decade? What is it that causes this? Historians point to several factors whose cumulative impact can lead to a crisis. One explanation posits that a nation's 8th decade ushers in the era of its 3rd generation. And I have kind of a joke that goes with this, but it says, while the 1st and 2nd generations are acutely aware of the great responsibility placed upon their shoulders and are prepared to sacrifice and make major concessions for the good of the nation, the members of the 3rd generation take the existence of the nation for granted and focus on their faction's narrow agenda. Yeah, I always say that, it's the grandfather who builds he starts the company, he builds the company and turns it into something mighty and great, and he passes it to his son, and his son takes what his father made and made it bigger and better. We see this all the time. The son then turns it into an even bigger conglomerate, into a bigger, massive empire of a corporation. And then the grandson is just spinning around in his Ferraris and just snorting coke and like blowing all the money and wasting everything because he was born entitled, did not see his dad work. His dad was rich by the time he was born, and he was just born into wealth, and he's just like lazy and comfortable and everything's fine, and he's just snorting coke and driving around as fast as he can in his Ferraris. That is what we see a lot when it comes to really not just nations, as they're saying, as these historians point out, but also to individual families. This often happens to immigrant families. You see the immigrant comes to America, works really, really hard, works in some really some grimy job in the dirt, doing the grime work. And they hope that their child is going to go off to college, go to school, and get a better job. And that kid goes and works hard and becomes, you know, an accountant or a lawyer or something. And then the third kid usually has a radical shift, and they're often, you know, in this case, they're not snorting coke and riding around their Ferraris, but they change their politics by the time they get to that third generation. You see that a lot. The third generation, their politics will shift, and they'll take for granted the hard work that their parent and their grandparent went through to give them a better life in a new nation, and they start wanting a lot of things to be given to them. You know, it's a very different mentality of what happens. So this isn't just what happens to nation, but it happens to individuals, it happens to companies. And this is what they're saying, is that third generation, that a generation is about 40 years. And so every 40 years, you get a new group of people that are in power, that they don't remember much from the 40 years before them. And by the time you get to that third 40-year mark, things just start to go haywire. It goes on to say, this is exactly what is happening today. The existence of the state is self-evident, even if there are serious threats from the outside, murderous Palestinian terrorism, Hezbollah missiles, Iranian nukes, and the like. With Hashim's kindness, we will overcome all of these threats. On the other hand, the tsunami of hatred and factionalism may cause the vision of the Third Temple to collapse from within in the spirit of Bourguiba's twisted vision. So again, that was written by a very religious Zionist organization, a person inside of a religious Zionist organization based in Jerusalem. So they have, they have very much visions of Israel being the entire land, and this curse could come into effect. I mean, quite frankly, I think it's very possible that what we're seeing now around the world is we're seeing a much stronger push for a two-state solution than we'd seen before. You've got Joe Biden continually pushing for it, even though Netanyahu has got different ideas, and Joe Biden's having to tell Netanyahu it's a bad idea to annex Gaza. It's a bad idea to annex the West Bank. You can't do this. We want a two-state solution, a place for the Palestinians where they can thrive. You can't do this. And we're seeing even Elon Musk, he came back from his trip, and what he's saying is he wants to see a two-state, not that he has much power, but, you know, it's still, he has a lot of control over a lot of the narrative, and that's what Israel was afraid of, and that's why they sent him out there. And they see that people are calling for a two-state solution. People are turning against Israel, and they're saying, wow, you are committing some real serious crimes, some egregious crimes are being committed against this group of people who are just trying to live on their land. They've been there forever, and now you want them to go somewhere else, which is not their country. You want them to leave to Egypt, or you want them to leave to Jordan when they are living in their country right now, and you have to give them rights, and you can't continue to rip those rights away from them and expect them to just sit there and take it without, of course, there being violence that stems from that. It's not, we don't have to say we agree with it. We don't have to say we excuse it, but we could say we understand how we got here. It's just like we understand why Russia invaded Ukraine. We understand how we got here. And so there very well could be in the next 5 years a serious shift in Israeli policy with the Likud party out, with Netanyahu out. We may see a drastic change in the entire ethos of that nation, and as it should, if for their own survival, for the good of the Israeli people, for the safety of the Israeli people, for the safety of the nation of Israel, for the safety of the Palestinian people, for the prosperity of the Palestinian people, the ethos of that nation, the ethos of that government, how they treat themselves, how they treat their own citizens, and certainly how they treat the Palestinians has to change. And when it does, it might, in a roundabout way, be fulfilling the curse of the eighth decade curse. But as when he mentioned all of these various different examples from Nazi Germany to fascist Italy to communist USSR, when they collapse, something better is born. And that may be the case. Those nations still exist. Those people are still there. But something else and something better could maybe rise from those ashes. So we will see. Debt. You go to bed thinking about it. You wake up thinking about it. High interest credit cards and loans make it nearly impossible to pay off your debt. And insane inflation keeps you stuck paycheck to paycheck. Well, the system traps you in debt. And Done with Debt is your lifeline. Done with Debt has an ingenious new strategy to help erase your debt faster and easier than you thought possible. Done with Debt knows how to get debt out of your life permanently. Here's what they can do for you. They can analyze all the debt options you qualify for. They can reduce bills. They can cut interest rates without bankruptcy and without a loan. Done with Debt are the experts and brilliant strategies for getting out of the debt trap, but you need to hurry because some debt solutions are time sensitive. So go to donewithdebt.com, find out how easy they make it. That is donewithdebt.com, donewithdebt.com. So Steve Kirsch, who has been incredibly vocal about COVID vaccines, which are, of course, safe and effective, was banned last year from speaking at the MIT auditorium with his own name on it. His own name on an auditorium. And they were like, oh, we don't want you to come and talk. No, Steve, it's Kirsch Auditorium. And they wouldn't even let Steve Kirsch in. Well, this year they have finally come around. And of course, now that the debate is nearly over because practically everyone got COVID, whether they were vaccinated or not. Here's an email that he says was circulated yesterday. Take a look at this email. And when we go through this email, this is the type of stuff that should have been said all along. Now it's being said, oh yes, after the fact, 4 years later. Should have been said, this should have been the approach the entire time. Dear MITers, we hope you enjoyed Thanksgiving. Welcome back to MIT, land of open inquiry, where Steve Kirsch, class of 80, inventor of the optical mouse and serial tech entrepreneur, will analyze one of the greatest taboos, vaccines, particularly COVID vaccines. So it's one of the greatest taboos. On Thursday, November 30th at 6 p.m. in 32123 Kirsch's own auditorium. Kirsch, for whom the large Stata Auditorium is named, tried to speak at MIT last year. He was ignored. When the MSOI was created, which is the MIT Students for Open Inquiry, we knew we had to give him a chance to present himself, as medical dissidents are routinely punished and smeared as anti-science cranks and disinformers. We are happy to platform Kirsch. The censorship educational complex and government medical establishment, especially MIT, have no right to silence Kirsch or any other medical freedom advocate. They can write hit pieces, but they can't hide from his response. On Thursday, find out if Steve Kirsch is a misinformation superspreader or a truth teller. Secure your place in Kirsch's crossing of the Rubicon here. So he's finally, this just goes to show that it doesn't matter how much money you have. Steve Kirsch is very, very wealthy. Wealthy enough to have an auditorium named after him at MIT. And they still ignored him when he said, I want to come and I want to talk about vaccines. I want to come and I want to give you the data. Here is a scientist who was graduated from MIT, who invented the optical mouse. And they're telling, you're anti-science. You are anti-science. We don't want to see any of your data. We don't want to see any of your pseudoscience about vaccines. And this is how they treated him. And now you've got this MIT Students for Open Inquiry, good for them, who have invited him and said, well, let's listen to him. And then we can decide if Steve Kirsch is a misinformation superspreader or a truth teller. It'll be up to them, the listener, to actually listen, because they can hear it, because it isn't censored, and then they can decide for themselves like adults. Isn't that amazing? When universities treat their college students, who are paying, by the way, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands to be there, like adults, as they should be treating them. Isn't it nice if our government were to treat us like adults and say, you can make up your own mind, we're going to give you the information, like they did in some of the Nordic countries, like Iceland, like they did in Sweden, like they did in Norway, when they said, well, here's the information and it's up to you. This is what we recommend. And but things change. And so we'll let you know when we know things have changed. That is the appropriate way to handle things. And yet this was not handled that way. The pandemic wasn't handled that way. Steve Kirsch, who, I've had him on this show. I've listened to a lot of his information. I've read a lot of his information. Some of it I agree with. Some of it I have a different interpretation of. But he still deserves to be heard. And I don't think he's out there spreading a bunch of misinformation. He might have assumptions he makes. Everyone makes assumptions, but that's science also. You have to make an assumption a lot of times. And even just to get started in the project or just to get started in the research, you have to make an assumption first. And then you go forward with that research. But this is the way it should have been from the beginning. But good for Steve, finally getting to Steve Kirsch being invited to Kirsch Auditorium to speak and to have his time at MIT. And we wish him the best of luck there this coming Thursday. All right, guys, that is it for tonight's show. Thank you so much for joining. Really appreciate you being here. Appreciate you watching the show. We do have another great one for you tomorrow night, 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. We will be back. If you have any comments or questions, you want to give me guest suggestions or topic ideas, I love hearing from you. Kim@KimIverson.com is how you can reach me. Otherwise, guys, we will see you tomorrow night. Until then, have a great one. Bye-bye.